There was Eru, the One, who in Arda is called Ilúvatar, and he made the first Ainur, the Holy Ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before naught else was made. This is the beginning of the tale of Middle-earth, a fantasy epic spanning thousands of years and one of the most influential fantasy universes ever created. More commonly known, perhaps, as the world of the Lord of the Rings, it is a story of countless tales of unmatched heroism and tragedy. This series will be my exceedingly humble attempt to cover the entirety of Middle-earth's history, beginning with the creation of the world in the First Age, and ending with the end of the Third Age and the coming of the Age of Men. Although not every video will be based on all of these books, the works I will cover include The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, including The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, The Return of the King, and their appendices. The Silmarillion, a collection of the stories Ainulindalë, Valaquenta, Quenta Silmarillion, Akalabeth, and of the Rings of Power. Children of Hurin, Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth, Beren and Luthien, The Fall of Gondolin and the Fall of Numenor, and The History of Middle-earth, volumes 10, 11, and 12, titled Morgoth's Ring, The War of the Jewels, and the Peoples of Middle-earth. There are more works related to Middle-earth, including the other volumes of History of Middle-earth and Nature of Middle-earth, History of the Hobbit, and Tolkien's personal letters, but I am choosing to focus on the more narrative books, where those others are more academic in nature, and I want to focus solely on the overarching story. By no means do I consider myself an expert in Tolkien and the mythology of his world, so please let me know in the comments if I mispronounce anything or forget any important details. With that being said, we shall now start at the beginning of it all, the creation of Arda. In the beginning, there was Eru Ilúvatar, the One. In Tolkien's universe, he can be considered the most powerful being, if you will, in existence, a god of gods. Eru then created the Ainur, who the beings of Middle-earth would essentially consider gods, somewhat in the same way Thor, Zeus, and Vishnu are gods in our world. The Ainur were initially scattered throughout the void and empty space at this time, singing alone. Eru, however, gathered them together and taught them greater harmony and understanding. For the plans of Eru were revealed to the Ainur, and he showed them a mighty theme that they were to sing for him. He granted them the power of the flame imperishable, which gave the Ainur the ability to create through song. Each of them was able to add their own elements to the song as well. So the Ainur began to sing, and slowly things were created. And a sound arose of interchanging melodies woven in harmony that passed beyond hearing into the depths and into the heights. And the music and the echo of the music went out into the void, and it was not void. Eru Ilúvatar sat back and simply let the Ainur sing, and he perceived no flaws were present in this song of creation. However, Melkor, one of the Ainur, had plans of his own. Melkor was the most powerful and knowledgeable of the Ainur, and he sought to weave his own ambitions and imaginings into the song. For Melkor also desired the flame imperishable and the power of creation, but that power is possessed by Eru and Eru alone. So Melkor began to sow his own thoughts and desires into the song, creating a discord among the harmony of the rest of the Ainur. This caused some Ainur to grow despondent at the song's changing, but some changed their song to fit Melkor's, the first of his corruptions. Nonetheless, the song of creation was interrupted, and to Eru Ilúvatar it seemed as if a storming sea raged around him, a myriad of dark waters. So Eru rose, and brought forth a second song, but Melkor responded with discord of equal power. By now the rest of the Ainur were not singing at all, and Eru came back again with the third song. This theme was the strongest and most beautiful of them all, and drowned out all the others. As the music finally ceased, Ilúvatar addressed Melkor and the other Ainur. Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor, but that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Ilúvatar, those things that ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath its uttermost source in me, nor can alter the music in my despite. For he that attempted this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined. This was Ilúvatar skill-checking Melkor, for though Melkor was the strongest of the Ainur, the discord and subversion of the Eternal Flame's powers were known to Ilúvatar and actually inspired by him. Ilúvatar was wholly responsible at the source of the songs for all things they create, and though Melkor may have thought he had devised creations of his own ambition, these were still the devising of Ilúvatar himself. Now the other Ainur felt fear, for they still did not know that Melkor was trying to steer the song to his own purposes. Melkor himself was now humbled and shamed, but now a dark anger began to grow in him. But Ilúvatar now led the Ainur into the void and showed them what their music had created. All the creations of the Ainur, even Melkor, were brought forth in a new world, though there were some things yet that are unforeseen to the Ainur. Even though it was their songs that created the world, it is the product of Ilúvatar at its truest essence, and he did not reveal wholly everything to them. Now the Ainur began to see the forecoming of the children of Ilúvatar, who were created in the third theme only to the knowledge of Eru himself. These are the peoples we know as the elves and men, also dubbed the firstborn and the followers. Upon learning of these children, the Ainur grew to love them, and knew in their songs they had unknowingly created them and the lands they would dwell in. And so all the Ainur, including Melkor, also saw a world within their universe, designed for the eventual arrival of the children of Ilúvatar. However, Melkor's cold anger and bitterness remained, and he began to devise his own plans for these lands. But he desired rather to subdue his will both elves and men, and he wished himself to have subjects and servants, and to be called Lord, and to be a master over other wills. The land seen by the Ainur was called Arda, filled with winds and waters and metals. It was to the oceans and seas the Eldar would be drawn to the most, as it was said they resembled the ancient music of the Ainur the most. The Ainu who held dominion over the waters of Arda was Olmo, whom Ilúvatar bestowed the greatest gifts of music. And Manwë, noblest of them all, held sway over the winds. Allë, whose skill and knowledge was only second to Melkor's, was given the earth, and was the craftsman of the Ainur. Arda was still a vision, though a beautiful one, to the Ainur at this point. So Ilúvatar turned to the void and sent forth the flame imperishable to be the heart of the new world. This was called Ea, and many Ainur journeyed into Ea, though some stayed with Ilúvatar outside of it. For the Ainur that went into Ea, Ilúvatar also bound their power to that world. Their power should thenceforward be contained and bounded in the world, to be within it forever, until it is complete, so that they are its life and it is theirs. The Ainur that entered Ea essentially were now bound to its fate, and were from that point called the Valar, the powers of the world. At that moment upon entering Ea, there was only unshaped darkness. So they began to build the earth, with Manwë, Olmo, and Melkor shouldering most of the work, though Melkor continued to meddle with the affairs of the Valar. Manwë, however, knew of Melkor's mischief and schemes and summoned many beings to help construct Arda. He confronted Melkor and told him the kingdom of Earth was not his to take. So Melkor separated himself from the rest of the Valar, and entered hiding in the most remote regions of Arda. Now the Valar, as the beautiful vision of Arda slowly came to fruition, chose to take upon physical form so that the children of Ilúvatar may eventually actually be able to see them. They had the power to adopt any appearance they wished, as well as to remain invisible to the perception of living beings of Arda. As the earth continued to grow in splendor and the power and beauty of the Valar grew in conjunction, Melkor grew bitterly jealous of them and their companions. Melkor then took a physical form himself, one that was dark and terrible. And he descended upon Arda in power and majesty greater than any other of the Valar, as a mountain that wades in the sea, and has its head above the clouds, and is clad in ice, and crowned with smoke and fire. And the light of the eyes of Melkor was like a flame that withers with heat, and pierces with a deadly cold. The Valar and all their might then rose to oppose Melkor, and this was the first battle for supremacy of Arda. For the Valar still wished to prepare its lands for the coming of the Elves, the Firstborn. Mighty lands and seas were built by the Valar, but were always swiftly corrupted by Melkor. It should be noted at this point that Melkor poured his power into Arda itself, thus dissipating his strength, if you will, to corrupt this creation of the Valar and pervert it to darkness. This is different from his lieutenant Sauron in the later ages, as he poured his malice and hate into the One Ring, which concentrated his powers and thus enhanced his abilities. However, at long last, Arda was at last completed and ready for the arrival of the children of Ilúvatar. The Valar were a subsect of the Ainur, godlike beings born into existence by Eru Ilúvatar, creator of Ea, the known universe the Lord of the Rings takes place in. Within this universe, the Valar built Arda, or Earth, as a place of habitation for the children of Ilúvatar, the elves and men. There are 7 lords of the Valar, with 7 queens called Valier to accompany them. Leader of the Valar and appointed first king of Arda was Manwë, who was second in power only to Melkor. Manwë was the Valar who most closely understood the intentions and vision of Eru Ilúvatar, and held dominion over Arda's wind and skies. His queen was Varda, Lady of the Stars, known to the elves as Elbereth. She was the Valar Melkor feared the most, and held dominion over Arda with Manwë in the Tower of Taniquetil, on top of Oilose, the highest mountain in Arda. It was said nothing passed on Middle-earth that was not seen or heard by the two. Manwë's closest friend and rival in power was Ulmo, the Lord of Waters. Also among the most powerful of the Valar was Aule, the crafter and maker of the lands in Arda. Aule was a mighty smith and taught the Noldor much of what they knew. Aule's wife was Yavanna, the giver of fruits. She held dominion over all things that grew in earth, and is called Kementari in Elvish. Next are Namo and Urmo, keepers of the spirits of the dead. Namo is more commonly called Mandos, the name of his dominion that lies in the west of Valinor. Mandos was the foreteller of doom of the Valar, and passes on the dooms and judgments of Manwë. His spouse was Vaire the Weaver, who wove stories of the ages in her webs in the halls of Mandos. Urmo, younger than Mandos, was the master of visions and dreams, and he held in sway the land of Lorien, a peaceful place where spirits reside. Este was his wife, and together they ruled over a heaven of sorts for spirits and the Valar when they tired of their labors in Arda. Nienna was the Valar associated with grief, for she mourned every wound suffered by Arda in the first battle against Melkor. She resided in the halls of Mandos and seldom journeyed to the bliss of Valinor. The strongest of the Valar was Astaldo the Valiant, or better known as Tolkas. While of not much use in times of council, he was a fiercely loyal companion and tremendous fighter. His wife was Nessa, the sister of Orome. Orome was the lord of the forest, and was known for his tremendous wrath and anger against his enemies. He rode a mighty horse named Nara, and blew a great horn called Valaroma. Among the Valar, 9 were held in greatest regard, but that number became 8 after the evil deeds of Melkor. The remaining 8 were dubbed the Aratar, with Manwë being their king in name. The companions of the Valar who assisted in the creation of Arda were the Maiar. They were lesser in power when compared to the Valar, but their might still far surpassed any mortal being or elf. Among the most renowned was Eonwë, the banner-bearer and herald of Manwë. Ase and Uinen were held most dear to the children of Ilúvatar. Ase was a chaotic spirit and resided in the waters closest to the shores of Arda, and his wife Uinen was the protector of the kingdom of Númenor. Melkor attempted to sway Ase to his side and was nearly successful, but his wife was able to restrain him and prevent the enemy from gaining control over the seas. And at last we come to Melkor himself, the great enemy of the Valar who was renamed Morgoth, the dark enemy of the world, by the elves. He was given the greatest gifts of all the Valar by Ilúvatar, but fell to evil and began to crave lordship over Arda and the other Valar. Darkness and fear were his dominion, and he was able to corrupt many Maiar to join his side. Among these were the Valaraukar, which we know better as the Balrogs. His chief servant was Sauron, or Gorthar the Cruel. Sauron was a Maiar of Aule and a great craftsman, and became instrumental in aiding many of Morgoth's darkest schemes. During the First War of Arda, Melkor held the advantage over the Valar for a long while. Then Tulkas, who at the time was merely considered a spirit of great strength, let loose peals of laughter and drove Melkor back, leading to a long era of peace. Tulkas became one of the Valar, and Melkor fled once more to the outer darkness of the world, and from then on forever held great hate in his heart for Tulkas. With this defeat of Melkor, the Valar were able to continue shaping Arda. Yavanna, wife of Aule, commissioned her husband to build 2 great lamps that would give light to Middle-earth, which was a continent on the planet of Arda. The lamps were set on 2 pillars that towered high above any mountains, one in the north and the other in the south. The northern lamp was Ilúin, the southern Ormal. During this time, there was endless light, and no passage of days or nights, simply time. Yavanna then planted many seeds, which grew and turned Middle-earth into a lush green landscape filled with animals, but not yet flowers or birds. In the middle of the continent was a great lake and the Isle of Almarin, which was the first dwelling of the Valar. Manwë then summoned the Valar and Maiar for a great feast to celebrate their labors on Arda. But Melkor looked on in hate, for he had many spirits in his service and spies among the Maiar. So as a being of darkness, he summoned his forces and came into Middle-earth in the north. It was there, where the lights of the 2 lamps were the dimmest, Melkor constructed great fortresses under the mountains. This stronghold became known as Utumno. The Valar did not know yet that Melkor had returned, but the strength of his magic was so powerful that his hate and darkness still flowed out from Utumno. This corrupted the lands of Arda, marring its spring with his evil. War broke out between the Valar and Melkor again, but it was Melkor who was able to land the first blow. He destroyed the lamps of Ilúin and Ormal, causing the seas to swell and fire to ravage the land. Arda was previously symmetrical in design, but this and the first creations of the Valar were forever destroyed after this attack. The earth was beset with chaos, and Melkor withdrew to Utumno to hide from the wrath of Manwë and Tulkas. The Valar were forced to quell the unrest, and they could not divide their might between this great effort and wresting Melkor from his fortresses. Melkor's devastating attack also destroyed Almarin, the dwelling of the Valar. Left with no place to live on Middle-earth, they departed for Aman, the westernmost continent on the edge of the world. It was encircled by Achaia, the outer sea, where beyond only lay the walls of night. As Melkor had gained a foothold in Middle-earth, the Valar and Aman raised mighty mountains on the eastern shore. These were the Pelori, and fortified their new lands against the enemy. Manwë's new throne was once more on the highest peak, Taniquetil, or Aman Ulios. Behind the Pelori, there was born a new region called Valinor, the new dominion of the Valar. It was a land of undying and great beauty, reminiscent and even surpassing the glory of the spring of Arda. Within the region of Valinor, the Valar built a great city called Valmar. Here, on a green mound named Azelohar, Yavanna brought forth 2 trees to replace the fallen lamps. The 2 trees of Valinor were a male and female. The male had dark green leaves dripping with silver dew, called Telperion. The female, Laurelin, had brighter green leaves tinged gold and brilliant yellow flowers. The first blooming of Telperion marked the opening hour of the ages in Valinor, and he would wane after 7, with Laurelin beginning to wax at the 6th hour. Thus began the count of standard 24-hour days, as well as the days of bliss of Valinor and the counting of time. As the ages in Valinor went on, the coming of the first children of Ilúvatar had not yet come to pass. Melkor grew ever stronger in Middle-earth, a land now ignored and dubbed the Outer Lands. Manwë continued to rule in Valinor atop his peak, though even his all-seeing eyes could not pierce the shadows and darkness that hid Melkor's plans. Yavanna came to Middle-earth from time to time to heal some of Melkor's blights on the land, and Orome would blow Valaroma while hunting the beasts of Melkor on its plains, but these visits were far and few between. Now time steadily approached for elves to come to Arda. Because the Valar did not wholly understand Ilúvatar's theme that had created the Firstborn, they did not endeavor to control them, instead serving more so as guiding presences rather than lords. After the Valar departed his halls in Ea for Arda, Ilúvatar gave great thought to the nature of his children, the elves and eventually men. He dubbed the elves the Quendi, and decided they would be the fairest creatures of Arda and enjoy the most bliss and beauty. For the men, or the Atani, he gave them a unique gift. Their hearts would be restless, ever seeking to forge their own path and shape their life. Ilúvatar also believed that men would be most susceptible to evil, and the elves said that it was men who were least favored by Manwë, as they reminded him the most of Melkor. Men were also given the gift of mortality, while the elves were immortal until the end of days in the world, unless they were killed in battle or by grief. Their strength never faded, and when they died, they were sent to the halls of Mandos to await a return. Men who die are called guests or strangers. At the eventual end of days and the world's end, it was said there would be a second music of the Ainur with purposes for both elves and men, though those designs are still only known to Eru Ilúvatar, the One. Now Ale, the great craftsman of the Valar, began to wish for a people to pass on his knowledge to. Even though this did not align with the initial designs of Ilúvatar, and was not done out of greed for power or lordship, Ale brought forth in secret the first 7 dwarven kings under the mountains. Ilúvatar, however, knew of the dwarves. Ale, upon being discovered, brought his hammer up to destroy them, but Ilúvatar was compassionate and took mercy upon Ale, for he was also glad to see the dwarves and the purpose they served. Ilúvatar's only condition was that the dwarves be kept under the earth until after the arrival of the elves. Now dwarves, as you may have guessed, were designed by Ale to be a hardy people. Their lifespan was longer than men but not immortal, and they were stubborn yet fiercely loyal friends. The dwarves believed upon dying they would be taken by Ale or Mahal to a separate hall from Mandos. There they would serve him and eventually aid in the rebuilding of Arda after the end of days. 7 fathers of the dwarves were first created by Aule, oldest of which was Durin. Upon awakening, he went to the caves above Keled Zaram in the Misty Mountains, where the mines of Moria were founded. The first Durin lived for so long he became known as Durin the Deathless, and 5 heirs were made from his line, all named Durin, for they bore a striking resemblance to their forefather. The dwarves were kept secret to all the Valar except Yavanna, who was concerned their love of the earth and its materials would harm the things that grew and lived in Arda. She approached Manwë for counsel, as she feared for her creations. Manwë thought on the matter, and recalled Ilúvatar foretold that certain spirits would awaken upon the arrival of the peoples of Middle-earth to protect the forests and mountains. Thus Manwë decreed that the eagles would hold dominion in the mountains, while the shepherds of the trees, the Ents, would take the forests. While Aman thrived in a state of prosperity under the Valar, Middle-earth lay forgotten in a state of endless twilight. In his stronghold of Autumno in the northern regions, Melkor gathered his strength, preparing for another attack on the Valar. Many monstrous beings and the corrupted spirits of the fiery Balrogs heeded his will. On his northwestern shore, Melkor also established Angband, a fortress for his chief lieutenant, Sauron. This marshalling of strength did not go unnoticed by the Valar, and some began to be concerned that the Firstborn would fall under the sway of Melkor when they came to Middle-earth. Many wanted to defeat Melkor before the coming of the elves, including Tolkas, but at the bidding of Manwë, Mandos foretold a doom. In this age the children of Ilúvatar shall come indeed, but they come not yet. Moreover, it is doomed that the Firstborn shall come in the darkness, and shall look first upon the stars. Great light shall be for their waning. To Varda ever shall they call at need. Then Varda, the wife of Manwë with the light of Ilúvatar shining in her face, crafted several stars from the dew of Telperion, the silver tree of Valinor. 7 stars were placed in the northern sky of Middle-earth to guide the elves and challenge Melkor. This mighty crown was Vala Sirca, the sickle of the Valar and sign of doom. These stars shone brightly in the skies, and it was under their light the Firstborn awoke, though the Valar did not know it yet. The stars were the first things seen by the elves, and ever after they revered starlight and Varda Elentari, Queen of the Stars. The area where the elves first awoke was Cuiviénen, a bay in the inland sea of Helkar in the far east. The sound of running water was the first thing heard by the elves as well, and like starlight held a special place in their hearts. For the elves upon awakening wandered Middle-earth, marveling at its beauty and naming the many things they saw. This marked the beginning of the First Age. The first elves to awaken were 3 males, named Imin, Tata, and Enel. They first saw the stars and beauty of Middle-earth, and awoke beside their spouses. The 3 couples devised many words, the first language of the elves, and walked a distance and found some more pairs. Their group grew to number 144, and each of the first 3 male elves chose a following to lead. Imin, the eldest, led a group of 14 elves, from which would come the Vanyar. The second oldest, Tata, had 56 companions who would be the forefathers of the Noldor. And Enel had the most numerous group, with 74 elves who would become the Teleri. They called themselves the Quendi, and they were discovered by accident by Orome when he heard them singing. He called them the Eldar, and began to lead them west. However, it was not Orome who found first the elves, but Melkor. He sowed fear and distrust in some, but not all, and a part of their people feared Orome upon his coming. Thus some of the Quendi fled before Orome, tricked by Melkor's darkness, but many of the most noble of the elves steeled their courage and followed him. The Quendi who fled, as well as those who vanished after straying from the group in the early days, were presumed to be captured by Melkor. From these elves he created and bred the terrible race of orcs, a perversion of Ilúvatar's vision of his firstborn children. The long-awaited arrival of the elves was met with much joy to the Valar, who began to prioritize the defeat of Melkor so that Middle-earth could be made safe. Thus the Valar mustered their arms and strode towards the north from Aman, and Melkor knew this battle was done for the sake of the elves, and he never forgot this. The Quendi were unaware of the cosmic battle taking place, for they were sheltered by the Valar. Melkor was driven from the northwest back to his fortresses in Autumno, where it was held under a lengthy and terrible siege. The shape of Middle-earth was changed forever by the great movings of land and water, and the continents of Aman and Middle-earth were driven further apart. The north became a wasteland, and several bays were created in the north into which the river Sirion flowed. At long last, however, Autumno's gates fell, and Tolkas himself imprisoned Melkor with a chain in Gaenor, and cast him before the Valar. Though now there would be a long peace, many evil beings that served Melkor escaped the Valar in the deep darkness, including Sauron. Melkor himself was brought to judgment before the Valar in the Ring of Doom in Valinor. He was sent to prison in the halls of Mandos for 3 ages, and upon the end of that sentence could plead for pardon. Then most of the Valar, seeking the fellowship of the elves and wanting to protect them from the lingering evils on Middle-earth, decided to summon the Quendi to Valinor, where they would then abide. Only a small few, including Ulmo, advocated they be left on Middle-earth to heal the land. However, after the summons were sent, Mandos only replied, "So it is doomed." So Orome was sent to gather the Quendi and lead them to Aman and Valinor, and he chose 3 elves to serve as ambassadors. They would go on to be the kings of the elves, and their names were Ingwe, Elwë, and Finwë. The 3 were taken to see the Valar, and were stunned at the power of the Valar and the glory of the 2 trees. Upon returning, all counseled their people to travel with them into the west. Most, but not all of the elves agreed to go, and those who left for the west were called the Eldar. Those who remained and were still captivated by the beauty Middle-earth yet held were called the Avari, or the Unwilling. 3 great hosts of the Eldar, or the Eldalië, then departed for Valinor. Ingwe, the High Lord of all elves, led the smallest party, later called the Vanyar, or the Fair People. These were the elves who departed Middle-earth and never returned, staying in Valinor until the end of days. The Vanyar were the Eldar most cherished by Manwë and Barda, and were forever devoted to the Valar. Finwë led a great host as well, to be called the Noldor, or the Deep Elves. These people were closest to Aule, and it is their trials and deeds in the north that compose much of the story. Last of all were the Teleri, the most numerous of the Eldar. They loved the sea and waters, and settled on the westernmost shores of Aman. The brothers Olwë and Elwë were their leaders. These 3 groups were known as the Calla Quendi, or Elves of the Light, for they alone had seen the light and splendor of Valinor. On Middle-earth there remained the Avari, or the Unwilling Elves, as well as those who set on the march west but strayed or became lost. They were called the Umanyar, and collectively with the Avari were dubbed the Mora Quendi, the Elves of Darkness. This name did not signify evil intent or corruption, but rather meant those elves never saw the light of the Valar. The journey west took many years, as the Eldar were also hesitant to push on whenever Orome left their hosts to ride forwards. They finally reached the river Anduin the Great and the high Hithaglir Mountains, or the Misty Mountains. It was here Lenwë of the Teleri broke away from the main group, and led his own host south down to Anduin, and these elves were known as the Nandor. The Noldor and Vanyar continued over the Misty Mountains and into the furthest west land of Middle-earth, Beleriand. Orome departed for Valinor to seek Manwë's counsel, and after some years, the Teleri also eventually crossed over into Beleriand. Among the Maiar was Melian, a being of unsurpassed beauty who dwelled in the gardens of Lorien. She journeyed then to Middle-earth for the awakening of the elves. At the end of the Eldar's march west, Elwë, lord of the Teleri, wandered into the woods of Nan Elma, and by chance heard the voice of Melian singing. Upon seeing her, he was left speechless, and it was said long years, perhaps hundreds, passed before any said a word to the other. Elwë did not return to the Teleri, who could not find him, and became thus led by Olwë, his brother. Melian also never went back to Valinor, so enchanted she was by Elwë. The two would eventually form their own kingdom, one of the only lands in Middle-earth that contained part of the light of Valinor. This kingdom was of the Grey Elves, the Sindar. Though they did not make the journey to Valinor, Thingol nonetheless had seen the light of the two trees and was still considered an elf of light. Upon the arrival of the elves in Beleriand, Ulmo brought from the depths of the sea an island as a bridge for them to cross into Aman. The Vanyar and the Noldor passed over, but the Teleri lingered on the western shores, waiting for Elwë and hearing the summons of Ulmo too late. A great number were left on the shores, but they came into the companionship of Ossë and Uinen and began to treasure the seas of the world. Nonetheless, this was another sundering of the Eldar. After a time, Ulmo returned to the Teleri and began to lead most of them into Valinor. Some chose to stay behind with Ossë and became the Falathrim. They were led by Círdan the Shipwright and were the first mariners and shipmakers of Middle-earth. Elwë's closest kin also lingered in Middle-earth until Elwë re-emerged as Thingol from the woods of Nan Elmoth. Though they all desired to one day see the light of Aman, Thingol cut a powerful figure, seeming to resemble a Maiar himself. Then Ossë, not wanting to be departed from the Teleri, asked Ulmo to stop the voyage and let the Teleri remain with him. Against the will of the other Valar, Ulmo agreed. He rooted the island in the Bay of Eldamar, where it was then called Tol Eressëa, the Lonely Isle. On Valinor, Finwë grieved, for he could not hope to reach the Teleri again lest it be in the halls of Mandos. The Teleri thus dwelled on Tol Eressëa, a lone point within sight of Aman. As for the Noldor and Vanyar, the Valar created a gap in the Pelori Mountains. It led to a green valley with a high hill, which the elves would call Tuna. It was on Tuna they built their first city of Tirion, crowned by the Tower of Ingwe, Mindon-Ildalieva. Yavanna also gave them a scion of the White Tree, a lesser image of Telperion called Galathilion. One of its seeds was eventually taken to the Lonely Isle, to be called Celeborn and eventually Nimla, the White Tree of Numenor. The Noldor began to learn from Aule, who loved them dearly. The House of Finwë swelled in number and skill, and it was they who discovered the first gems of the earth and the means of crafting them. Their king, Finwë, had 3 sons, Fëanor, Fingolfin, and Finarfin. Fëanor was born to Finwë's first wife, Miriel, while Fingolfin and Finarfin were the sons of Indis of the Vanyar. Fëanor had the strongest heart and spirit of the brothers, with unmatched skill in speech and crafting. He himself had 7 sons, Maedhros the Tall, Maglor the Singer, Celegorm the Fair, Caranthir the Dark, Cruderfin the Crafty, and the hunter twins Amrod and Amras. Fingolfin was the mightiest of Finwë's sons, a tremendous warrior and most valiant of all the Noldor. His children were Fingon, Turgon, Argon, and their sister Aradhel. Last of all, Finarfin was the wisest of the brothers, and he had 4 sons, Finrod, Orodreth, Angrod, and Egnor. However, most famous of all was Finarfin's daughter, Galadriel, the most enchanting beauty in all the House of Finwë. Finarfin himself was married to Eärwen, the daughter of Olwe, king of Alqualonde, thus making his children related to Thingol of Doria. Now Galadriel was uniquely beautiful among the Noldor, and also grew to be one of the tallest of their people. Perhaps her greatest marvel, however, was her hair. It was gold and rich and radiant, and seemed to be touched by the light of the two trees. It was a true beauty of the world, and was said to be Fëanor's inspiration for his greatest creation sometime later. Over time, the Teleri began to desire to go to Valinor and reunite with their kin. So Ulmo, pitying them, sent Osse to help craft a fleet of ships. These vessels were then pulled by swans over the sea, and the Teleri at last came to Valinor, where they struck up a close friendship with the Noldor. Olwe set up his seat of rule in Alqualonde, the haven of the Teleri swan ships. Meanwhile, the Vanyar, still deeply devoted to Manwë, began to slowly leave Tirion and become apart from the Noldor. This time was known as the Noontide of Valinor, as the children of Ilúvatar, albeit incompletely, had at last made it to Valinor and Melkor remained in chains. Cúru Finwë, or better known in later ages as Fëanor, was born as the first son of Finwë in this time. However, so strong he was of spirit that his birth utterly consumed his mother, Miriel, who told Finwë the strength had many had gone only into him. She was taken to the gardens of Lorien, where her spirit departed but her body remained. Finwë grieved, and poured his attention thereafter into Fëanor, who became fierce in spirit, such that he could not be swayed by outside influences and was unsurpassed in the skill of crafting. His wife, Nerdanel, was only able to change his mind for a time, but even she eventually fades from his history. Finwë's second marriage to Indis of the Vanyar was not particularly pleasing to Fëanor, and he remained largely apart from his half-brothers Fingolfin and Finarfin, though in his heart he always had great love for Finwë. For the Lady Galadriel, though, he admired her beauty for a time, and approached her asking for one of her golden hairs, which shone with the light of Valinor. Yet she turned him away 3 times, and from then on their hearts were cold towards each other. For Galadriel mistrusted Fëanor and perceived in him a deep darkness. Eventually, however, the 3H sentence of Melkor's chaining drew to a close. Upon being brought forth before the Valar and witnessing the glory of the Eldar, Melkor's heart was filled with more hate and envy. Most of all, he desired the jewels of the Eldar, but hid this intent from Manwë as he sued for pardon. Now Manwë granted Melkor his pardon on condition he remain confined in Valmar. However, it is important to note that Manwë was a being in which there was no evil and utterly no comprehension of evil. Therefore he could not comprehend the darkness within Melkor and his deceits. Ulmo and Tolkas did not trust Melkor, but deferred to the judgment of Manwë nonetheless. And so Melkor walked free once more, with a new, burning hatred of the elves and the gifts they enjoyed from the Valar. He offered them his friendship, counsel, and services, but only the Noldor listened to his words, for the Vanyar were devoted to Manwë, and the Teleri were deemed too weak by Melkor. But Fëanor he could not hope to sway, for the first son of Finwë had a deep hatred of Melkor that would never vanish. Fëanor now came to the height of his powers, and was now truly one of the greatest among the Noldor. He began to endeavor on a secret project, and constructed 3 magnificent jewels. Neither the technique nor even material they were made of was ever shared by Fëanor, but their beauty was forever unquestioned. They appeared to be diamond and were unbreakable, and somehow within them Fëanor was able to weave the light of Valinor itself. His heart was bound to the Silmarils, and it was foretold by Mandos the fate of Arda lay with these great jewels. Melkor, meanwhile, began to lust for the Silmarils, desiring them above all else. Thus he began to work to tear apart the Noldor, operating quietly with subtle lies and deceit. His influence slowly began to grow, and Melkor even designed to turn the Noldor against the Valar themselves, claiming they were summoned to Valinor out of the Valar's jealousy, that they would create works surpassing the beauty of Valinor itself. And so the peace of Valinor began to wither away, and the Valar began to notice the rumblings of discontent within the Noldor. Even Fëanor began to be tempted by the notion of freedom from Valinor, albeit not directly at the insistence of Melkor. He began to be fiercely protective and even obsessive over the safety of his magnum opus, the Silmarils. He seldom remembered now the light within them was not his own. Melkor now began to drive a schism between the sons of Finwë, telling each of them the other was plotting to seize power for himself. Jealousy and mistrust in the Noldor continued to grow, and their crafting turned from works of art to weapons of war. But this was another ploy of Melkor, for he warned each elf in secret so that they believed they, and they alone, were the only ones to be making arms. Eventually, Fëanor grew so bold as to begin to openly speak against the Valar, seeking to return to Middle-earth away from the shackles of Valinor. A troubled Finwë summoned his lords for counsel, and by chance Fingolfin took his ear first, saying Fëanor was going too far. Then Fëanor burst in, fully armed with shining weapons and armor. He drew a sword and pointed it at Fingolfin, telling him to stand back before him, the eldest son. Fingolfin turned to leave, and Fëanor then threatened his life if he should ever try and supplant him. News of this soon reached Manwë, who was troubled. Fëanor had sinned greatly in threatening Fingolfin, and was thus summoned before the Valar in the Ring of Doom. The manipulations of Melkor were then uncovered, but for breaking the peace of Valinor, Fëanor was exiled from Tirion for 12 years. He would only be permitted to return if forgiven by his kin, which Fingolfin promised to do. Fëanor and his 7 sons then departed Tirion, accompanied by Finwë, who still loved his son dearly, and they established a fortress at Formenos, where the Silmarils were held. Though Melkor's schemes had been ruined, the bitterness and darkness sowed among the Noldor would never completely vanish. Tulkas then searched for Melkor, but the enemy had vanished as a dark cloud and was able to evade his pursuit. Melkor then visited Fëanor in banishment, attempting to sway him to his side once more. And Melkor very well may have been successful, but he then implied the Silmarils would not be safe in Formenos. This was a step too far, and Fëanor threw him from his halls. Melkor retreated into hiding once more, and for a time, peace was uneasily restored. Melkor fled to the southern lands, away from the watch of Orome and Tulkas. The Valar were unable to find him, for Melkor had the ability to change his form at will. Melkor settled in Avanthar, a land just past the Bay of Eldamar filled with shadows, mountains, and cold, dark seas. It was there he met Ungoliant, a massive spider. Ungoliant seems to have been a former servant of Melkor, but she left his service and began to desperately try and fulfill her desire to consume light. Ungoliant was essentially a void, one that desired to consume the light of Valinor itself. Melkor now approached her, and the 2 powerful entities began to plot against the Valar. Ungoliant was promised whatever reward she desired, something that seemed small to Melkor at the time but would have larger ramifications later. During this time, the elves and Valar were holding a great feast on Tanaquetil, celebrating Valinor, unaware of Melkor's movements. This left the great city of Valimar abandoned for the time being. Additionally, though Fëanor and his brothers were reunited, Finwë remained in Formenos, stating he would not attend for as long as Fëanor was banned from Tirion. Fëanor and Fingolfin ended their feud and shook hands, but at that fateful moment, Melkor and Ungoliant struck. Passing as a dark cloud into the north, they came to the undefended city of Valmar and approached the 2 trees of Yavanna. Then Melkor, in an act of great evil, stabbed each tree with a spear, and Ungoliant ravished herself on their sap as they died. The light of Valinor faded, and a great darkness and terror settled over the land. It suffocated all living beings, seeming to permeate their hearts and minds. The Valar knew immediately it was the work of Melkor, but could not pursue him and Ungoliant, and the enemy's vengeance was achieved. With the 2 trees destroyed, only the Silmarils remained as a last remembrance of their light. Yavanna then asked Fëanor if she could use the great jewels in a bid to restore the trees, but Fëanor firmly rejected her request, saying that if he were to break them, it would break his heart as well, and he would be the first elf slain in Aman. But then Mando spoke up, ominously stating, "Not the first." Fëanor became steadfast in his refusal to surrender the Silmarils, but then dire news arrived. For after the sundering of the trees, Melkor and Ungoliant had then fallen upon Formenos. There Finwë, High King of the Noldor, was slain, and marked as the first blood spilled in Aman. And they told that Melkor had broken the stronghold of Formenos, and taken all the jewels of the Noldor that were hoarded in that place. And the Silmarils were gone. A terrible anger took Fëanor, for he loved Finwë and his jewels dearly. He renamed Melkor Morgoth, the black foe of the world. But also he cursed the Valar, for it was their summons and ignorance that left Formenos undefended. Meanwhile, Melkor and Ungoliant arrived at the outer lands of the north. There, Ungoliant took her reward, consuming the Noldor's jewels. But Morgoth withheld the Silmarils, for he coveted them deeply, and refused to hand them over. Ungoliant attacked him with dark webs, and he let out a terrible cry. It is said his voice forever echoed in the mountains there as a clamor of anguish, and that region was then known as Lamoth. The cry of Morgoth shook the very earth, and summoned the Balrogs from hiding in the ruins of Angband. They swarmed Ungoliant, who fled down to Beleriand and into Ered Gorgoroth, which became known as Nandungortheb, the Valley of Dreadful Death. Her final fate was unknown, with some claiming she devoured herself when her famine was mightiest. Yet there she bore offspring, and the hideous spiders and their webs would haunt that region for long after. Morgoth, however, was now freed and in possession of the 3 Silmarils. He raised the mountains of Thangorodrim above Angband, which he rebuilt as well. Hordes of orcs were bred, and darkness now ruled over Beleriand. Morgoth's hands were charred black and burned with pain after clutching the Silmarils, and he put them in an iron crown, but its weight was terrible and tiring. His domain in the north was now vast, and he rarely left his vaults down in Angband from there on after. The dismayed Noldor returned to Tirion, and by this point Fëanor was stoked to the point of open rebellion against the Valar. A powerful speaker, and now the default High King of the Noldor, Fëanor rallied against the gods of the elves, calling them jealous of the Eldar and unable to protect their own realm. He urged the Noldor to venture into Middle-earth, defeat Morgoth, and reclaim its lands for themselves. Part of this motivation laid in the foretelling of the coming of men, for the elves feared they may wish to supplant them. Then Fëanor took a terrible oath, in which all 7 of his sons joined in. Together, they vowed to pursue and reclaim possession of the Silmarils from any living being, naming Manwë as witness. The oath was binding, and could not be broken until the end of days or the deaths of them all. Fingolfin and his son Turgon spoke out against the dangers of the oath, and Finarfin advised caution. Yet in great haste, Fëanor amassed the majority of the Noldor and prepared them for a long march. The Valar remained silent and simply waited and watched. Fingolfin and Finarfin also joined the host, though reluctantly, in its rearguard. As they set out, a messenger arrived from Manwë, decreeing the Valar would neither aid nor hinder their journey, but that Fëanor was now exiled from Valinor. But the pride of Fëanor was great, and he sent the messenger away and led the Noldor on. The host moved north, and Fëanor soon realized they would need ships to cross the seas, with the logical answer being the swan ships of the Teleri. However, the Teleri did not wish to move against the will of the Valar, and refused to give Fëanor any ships or help him build any. Fëanor was furious at Olwe, their prince, and pondered his next moves. Then, he decided to simply take the ships by force and began boarding the Noldor. The Teleri resisted, and soon battle broke out. However, it was rather one-sided, as the Noldor were mightier in strength of arms and fought with the desperation of an exiled people, while the Teleri mainly defended themselves with bows. Fingolfin also arrived at the side of the Noldor, but his forces were late and attacked the Teleri before knowing the true nature of the conflict. This was the kinslaying at Alqualondë, one of the first great evils committed by the Noldor for the sake of the Silmarils. The Maiawinan mourned the killing of many Teleri and caused the seas to storm and sink many ships. Nonetheless, many of the Noldor made it to the northern lands, a cold and mountainous region. Then Mandos himself arrived, as Herald of Manwë, to deliver punishment for the kinslaying. There he proclaimed the doom of the Noldor, a prophecy that would reverberate throughout the coming ages. Tears unnumbered ye shall shed, and the Valar will fence Valinor against you, and shut you out, so that not even the echo of your lamentation shall pass over the mountains. The speech went on for a time more, and the house of Fëanor became cursed. It was proclaimed they would turn to great evil to repossess the Silmarils, which would never again come back into their hands. Upon hearing the doom, however, Fëanor was unfazed. Then Finarfin, who was filled with regret over the actions of the Noldor, led a great part of his people back to Valinor, where they were pardoned by the Valar. However, his sons and Galadriel remained with Fëanor, as well as Fingolfin and his people. Galadriel hated Fëanor for the slaughter of the Teleri, her kin, but her pride demanded she not return to Valinor and beg for pardon. Instead, she looked to lessen the evils of Fëanor as he led the Noldor. So the Noldor pressed on, reaching the far north of Ardna and the daunting Helcaraxë. The task was now to cross the Sea of Beligere, or the Helcaraxë itself and its mountains of ice. Many had already been lost on the journey, but Fëanor also knew there still weren't enough ships to take everyone across. So he summoned his sons, and with their closest kin, seized the ships and slipped away from the rest of the host. Fingolfin they left in the wastes of Amaran, but upon landing on the shores of Middle-earth, Fëanor committed a great evil and ordered the ships to be burned. Only Maedhros stood apart from the other sons as the great betrayal was done. And Fingolfin and his people saw the light afar off, red beneath the clouds, and they knew that they were betrayed. But Fingolfin decided to press on to Middle-earth, and showing their might and valor, his people crossed the Helcaraxë. Led by Fingolfin, his sons, and Finrod and Galadriel, the children of Finarfin, at great suffering they too came to Middle-earth. During this time, Thingol, formerly known as Elwë, brother of Olwe, and Melian, consolidated their holdings in Middle-earth. Amidst the first chaining of Melkor, they had their only child, Luthien. A time later, the dwarves came into Beleriand, where they were called the Naugrim, the stunted people, and Gonhirim, masters of stone, by the elves there. They had many settlings in the region, but their greatest, Khazad-dûm, was far away in the misty mountains. It was the dwarves of Noldor and Belargos that first made contact with the Sindar, and a great friendship began between the two peoples. The Naugrim then built a great mansion for Thingol, who awarded them with beautiful pearls from Círdan the shipwright. Into the earth itself they carved countless chambers for Thingol, and this was then called Menegroth, the Thousand Caves. There was then peace for a time after its completion. During the third age of the captivity of Melkor, however, the dwarves grew troubled at the lingering evils in the north of Beleriand, among them orcs awaiting the return of their Dark Lord. So the Nalgrim then taught the Sindar the art of weapon making, and they were able to drive back the darkness for the time being. Meanwhile, the separate host of Lenwë, who had broken away from the Teleri during their march to Valinor, also came into contact with the Sindar. They were led by Denethor, Lenwë's son, and were greeted by Thingol. They settled in Osarion, the land of 7 rivers. Many elves wandered freely across their lands, for they knew the evils of Melkor posed no serious threat at the time. However, that all changed with the poisoning of the 2 trees. With the newfound freedom of Morgoth, orcs multiplied by the droves, catching the elves by surprise in the first battle of the Wars of Beleriand. Menegroth was attacked from the west, cut off from Círdan, and Denethor and the elves of Osarion rode to Thingol's aid. Orcs also came from the east, but were slaughtered and driven back to Angband by a joint force of elves and dwarves. Thingol's realm was protected, but at a grievous cost. Denethor fell on the hill of Amon-Ereb, and the remnants of his people never took a king again. Some merged with Thingol's people, but many took to wandering the realm in secrecy and called themselves the Lequendi, or the Green Elves. Thingol, after driving the orcs back from Osarion, then turned to save Círdan, who was being driven towards the sea. Then Melian created a field of protection around Thingol's kingdom, which was called the Girdle of Melian. It allowed no one to pass without the consent of her or Thingol, and the land within it was then called Doriath. Doriath thus became a bastion of peace in Beleriand in its darkness, now overrun by the servants of Morgoth. Back in Valinor, the Valar were in a state of mourning for both the death of the 2 trees and the corruption of Fëanor. Manwë became more despondent when he learned of Fëanor's response to his herald, but remained hopeful that good would eventually triumph. But Mandos ominously said evil would yet remain, and also foretold the death of Fëanor would be soon. The Valar now began to heal Valinor from the wounds it suffered from Morgoth. Manwë asked Yavanna and Nienna to try with all their might to heal the trees, but Telperion was only able to bear a single silver flower, and Laurelin 1 golden fruit. The dead husks of the trees were left as memorials, and Aule crafted vessels for the surviving fruit and flower. Then Varda sent them to the skies to illuminate Middle-earth and hinder the plans of Morgoth. This was also done to help the Hildar, or the Aftercomers. These were to be men, the younger children of Ilúvatar, though it was not yet known when they would come to the world. 2 beings were chosen to guide the vessels, Arien for the fruit and Tilion for the flower. Together they would be the sun and moon that lit Middle-earth during its days and nights. Then the Valar, wanting to fortify their lands against Morgoth, raised towering mountain walls in the north, east, and south. Only the pass at Cala Sirja remained to the elves. Additionally, to further hide Valinor, the enchanted isles were raised in the seas as a barrier in front of Tol Eressëa. Thus Valinor, the blessed realm, became shut off, and the Noldor now had no hope of ever returning. Now the time came for the years of the sun, which were faster than the years of the trees, and began when Morgoth held uncontested dominion over Middle-earth. Yet despite this, the realms of Beleriand began to teem with life, as Morgoth was held at bay by Yavanna's light in the sun, and during this time men awoke in the eastern regions of Hildorian. They wandered west, following the sun, and were named the Atani by the Eldar. They befriended many of the Dark Elves, but never met any of the Valar, and thus came to fear rather than love and revere them. After the burning of the Teleri ships, Fëanor and his remaining host continued up the Firth of Drengist and into the land of Hithlum. There they were attacked by a great army of Morgoth, who sought to test Fëanor's strength. This was the second battle of the Wars of Beleriand, also called Dagor Aglareb, the Battle Under the Stars. Though the Noldor were heavily outnumbered, their warriors were fierce and venomous in their anger, and Fëanor's forces massacred the orcs, driving them back. For 10 days they cut down orcs as they fled all the way back to Angband. But here, in his pride, Fëanor overstepped, pushing ahead of the main army. Balrogs then came from Angband, cutting Fëanor off from support. The High King fought long and hard, but was cut down and mortally wounded by Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs. His sons rushed him away, but Fëanor knew his time on Middle-earth was drawing to a close, and ordered them to stop on a mountain pass. Fëanor looked out in the distance and saw Thangorodrim, the towering stronghold of Morgoth, and knew then in his heart no power of the Noldor could hope to overcome the enemy. As he passed, his body dissolved into ashes, such was the strength of the fire in his spirit. The Noldor eventually came into contact with the Sindar in Mithrin, and also learned of King Thingol in Doriath. For the Dark and Grey Elves, the arrival of the Noldor host instilled hope, as they believed them to be emissaries of the Valar, a twist of cruel irony. Then Morgoth offered to surrender to the sons of Fëanor, even offering a Silmaril. However, the talks were a ruse, and the sons and Morgoth himself both sent ambushing forces to the parley. There, Morgoth prevailed and took Maedhros, Fëanor's eldest son, as captive back to Angband. The remaining brothers then set up a great camp in Hithlum, but Maedhros was chained to a precipice on Thangorodrim, hanging only by his right wrist. The host of Fingolfin then arrived, standing tall and strong, and swept the remaining enemy forces back to Angband. Fingolfin then withdrew to find the sons of Fëanor and rest his people. The Noldor were now a host divided, with Fingolfin holding the sons as accomplices of their father, while those loyal to Fëanor remained constrained by their oath. Morgoth reveled in this, but Fingon, son of Fingolfin, took it upon himself to heal the feud. For Fingon was close friends with Maedhros, and now looked to rescue his companion. He snuck onto the Thangorodrim, and in defiance of the forces of darkness, began to play a song of old on his harp. Then Maedhros, upon hearing the music, sang in response and was found by Fingon. But the steel ring chaining him to the mountain could not be cut, and Maedhros begged Fingon to kill him. But Fingon sent a cry out to Manwë, asking for pity. Then Thorondor, king of the eagles and the mightiest bird to have ever lived on Middle-earth, descended from the sky. To save Maedhros, Fingon cut off his right hand, and Thorondor took them both back to Mithrin. Fingon won great renown upon their return, and Maedhros eventually healed to become a deadly warrior with his left hand. The houses of Fëanor and Fingolfin renewed their friendship, and Maedhros ceded kingship of the Noldor to Fingolfin, though all his brothers privately did not agree with the decision. A watch was set upon Angband from the west, south, and east, and the Noldor began to explore the rest of Beleriand. King Thingol was hesitant to open his gates for the Noldor, only allowing the sons of Finarfin to enter his realm. As the Lord of Beleriand, but not in its entirety, he granted to the Noldor lands that yet lay out of his control and wild in nature. Several of the sons of Fëanor were angry at the seemingly lukewarm welcome, but Maedhros urged restraint and led their people to the hill of Himring. This region came to be known as the March of Maedhros. Meanwhile, his brother Caranthir led his people to the arid Luin, where they met the dwarves. They formed a tentative alliance, purely out of their enmity towards Morgoth. After 20 years of peace, Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, held a massive feast, and it was a time of great hope and optimism, for several prosperous kingdoms had been formed and it seemed Morgoth was now contained in Angband. 30 years later, Turgon, son of Fingolfin, and Finrod, son of Finarfin, were visited by Ulmo on the island of Tol Sirion while sleeping. They were each given a message bidding them to search for sources of hidden strength, to prepare for the day that Morgoth chose to break out of Angband. So each went on his own separate journey to heed Ulmo's warning. Finrod and his sister Galadriel visited Thingol and Doriath, and Finrod was amazed at the majesty of Menegroth. He told Thingol of his dream with Ulmo and was shown to the caverns of Narog. There he built a vast complex of chambers akin to Menegroth with the help of the dwarves from the Blue Mountains. His delving into the earth brought forth many treasures, and Finrod was also given the Nauglamir, a necklace of gold and uncounted gems of old. He became known as Finrod Felagund, Hewer of Caves. As for his sister Galadriel, she stayed in Doriath with the company of her lover, Celeborn, and learned much from Melian. Meanwhile, Turgon came to believe he was destined to build a great city upon a hidden hill. After a year of fruitless searching, he was visited again by Ulmo, who led him into the Vale of Sirion and the hidden Vale of Tumladen in the encircling mountains. Turgon saw a great hill of stone and began to devise a city modeled after Tirion in Valinor. Morgoth soon came to believe the lords of the Noldor now grew complacent and issued his forces once more from Angband. The land shook and volcanoes spewed fire, and orcs issued forth onto the plains of Ardgallen. However, Maedhros and Fingolfin were ready and destroyed the forces of Morgoth, sending them back to Angband's gates once more. This was the Dagor Aglareb, the Great Battle and third of the Wars of Beleriand. The Noldor then besieged Angband, which turned into a stalemate lasting nearly 400 years. For the gates of Angband were unassailable and impossible to wholly surround, and Morgoth was still able to send spies into their camp, spreading discord and dissension wherever he could. After 100 years of siege, he sent out another probing force at Hithlum from the west, but that too was soundly defeated. Morgoth then knew the orcs were no match for the Noldor in open battle, and began to seek out new strategies. 100 years later, the first Uruk-loki, Glaurung, a fire drake of the north, came from Angband. Though still young for a dragon, he drove back the elves until they were rallied by Fingon, and there was peace for 200 long years. During this time, the kingdoms of the elves prospered, with the Noldor excelling in craft and war, while the Sindar were more skilled in words and music.